Inspector Merriweather, who possessed the admirable quality of recognizing superior intellect when confronted with it directly, immediately dispatched Constable Davies to Greylodge's library to verify the claim about the clock, a task the young officer undertook with the sort of earnest determination that suggested he had only recently graduated from whatever provincial academy trained such individuals. The canon, meanwhile, seized upon the opportunity to elaborate upon the deceased Mr. Grayson with the sort of biographical detail that clergymen seem constitutionally incapable of abbreviating. Nathaniel Grayson, it transpired, had been a gentleman of considerable private means, derived from interests in cotton mills and certain rather lucrative investments in South African enterprises, the sort of wealth that did not require its possessor to engage in anything resembling honest labor. He had arrived at Greylodge 15 years prior, had conducted himself with outward propriety, maintained cordial if somewhat distant relations with his neighbors, and had devoted himself primarily to the collection and study of antiquarian manuscripts, particularly those pertaining to what the canon diplomatically termed the older traditions of rural practice. Whimsy, whose familiarity with euphemistic language was comprehensive, immediately grasped that Mr. Grayson had been engaged in the study of witchcraft, or at minimum that particular subcategory of historical research that causes country clergy to exchange meaningful glances and lower their voices to confidential tones. The household staff, according to Inspector Merriweather's preliminary inquiries, consisted of 6 individuals: Miss Hartley, the housemaid, who had discovered the body, Mrs. Eleanor Craddock, the housekeeper, aged 62, and apparently possessed of the sort of unimpeachable character that comes from having managed households, since before most people had learned to properly tie their shoes, Mr. Silas Kedge, the butler, aged 48, who had previously served in a similar capacity at several distinguished London establishments, and carried himself with that particular blend of superiority and discretion that marks the truly accomplished servant. Young Thomas Wickham, the footman and ostler, aged 19, and reportedly rather dim but harmless, Mrs. Sarah Wickham, Thomas's mother and the cook, who had been with Grayson for 12 years, and finally, old Mr. Peridot, the gardener, who was apparently 93 years old, and maintained the vegetable plots with the sort of obsessive dedication one ordinarily associates with religious devotion. Constable Davies returned from the library at this juncture to report, with barely concealed excitement, that the clock on the mantelpiece was indeed running precisely 20 minutes slow, a discovery that seemed to gratify Whimsy considerably more than the facts of the murder itself appeared to warrant. It was at this moment that Canon Fotheringham Thomas, with some evident reluctance and considerable circumlocution, introduced the matter of Grayson's will, a document that had been altered only 6 weeks prior, and which suggested that the deceased gentleman had entertained somewhat more decisive feelings about his various relatives than one might have anticipated. The primary beneficiary was to be Grayson's younger sister, Miss Constance Grayson, aged 49, who had been living abroad in Florence for the past 20 years and who maintained correspondence with her brother through the mediumship of occasional letters composed in an elegant italic script. However, Grayson's nephew, Mr. Edmund Grayson, aged 31, and currently residing in the village itself in a cottage adjacent to the churchyard, had been written out of the original will entirely, a reversal of fortune that apparently had not been greeted with philosophical acceptance. Additionally, there was the matter of a curious bequest to the village church, a sum of £2,000 to be used for the explicit purpose of restoring the east window and eradicating all trace of what foolishness remains in the stones, a provision that had struck the canon as both generous and somewhat alarmingly specific in its implications. Whimsy inquired, with studied nonchalance, whether anyone had thought to examine the key that supposedly locked the library door from the inside, a key that, one gathered, had been discovered in Mr. Grayson's waistcoat pocket after death. Inspector Merriweather admitted, with barely concealed embarrassment, that the key had been examined only superficially and that no particular attention had been paid to its condition or whether it actually secured the lock at all. The possibility that a man might be poisoned in a locked room whilst that room remained entirely accessible to murderers possessed of even elementary knowledge of mechanics did not, Whimsy reflected with quiet amusement, seem to have occurred to the local authorities. Mrs. Fotheringham Thomas offered tea, which Whimsy declined with polite firmness, instead requesting permission to examine the library itself, and, more particularly, to conduct interviews with the household staff in sequential order, beginning with the housekeeper. The canon, recognizing that he was being gently but unmistakably displaced from his own narrative, seemed to regard this development with a mixture of relief and obscure resentment, rather like a parent being superseded in the care of his own troublesome offspring by someone who actually appeared to possess competence in the matter. As Whimsy rose to proceed toward the library, he made a single observation to Inspector Merriweather. A locked room, he suggested, was merely a puzzle waiting for someone sufficiently motivated and sufficiently clever to solve it. The question was not how the murderer had accomplished the feat, but rather why they had chosen to accomplish it at all, when simpler methods were undoubtedly available. This distinction, Whimsy continued, often represented the crucial difference between a crime of opportunity and a crime of deliberate design, and deliberate design, in his experience, inevitably revealed something considerably more unsettling than mere homicidal impulse. The library of Greylodge revealed itself to be precisely the sort of room one might expect from a gentleman of Nathaniel Grayson's particular scholarly inclinations. Shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, their spines displaying titles in Latin, Greek, medieval French, and several languages that appeared to have been devised primarily to confound the average reader, a substantial mahogany desk positioned to command a view of the garden through tall sash windows, and the aforementioned armchair, upholstered in dark green velvet, positioned at an angle that suggested its occupant had spent considerable time gazing into the fireplace whilst contemplating matters of esoteric significance. The room itself was notably cold, despite the mild October weather, a phenomenon that Whimsy traced to the single radiator, which he discovered to be not merely dormant, but apparently disconnected from whatever heating apparatus serviced the remainder of the house. Inspector Merriweather, when questioned on this matter, could only produce the information that he had not previously noticed the radiator's inoperability, a confession that Whimsy received with the sort of neutral expressi. On that, somehow conveyed profound skepticism, without descending into actual discourtesy. The carpet, a Persian piece of considerable antiquity and obvious value, bore the peculiar characteristic of being positioned several inches away from the baseboards on the room's western wall, a displacement that seemed curious until Whimsy examined the wooden paneling beneath and discovered evidence that the radiator had been deliberately pushed backward, likely to create precisely the sort of gap that might admit a draft without the draft being immediately visible to an observer positioned in the armchair. The mantelpiece clock, when examined by Whimsy with the sort of meticulous attention ordinarily reserved for illuminated manuscripts, revealed itself to be a mechanism of elegant but elementary construction, the sort of timepiece that might have been operated by a child possessing only rudimentary mechanical knowledge, and which could be deliberately retarded simply by allowing the pendulum to swing slightly out of true. The poison itself, according to the medical report that Inspector Merriweather had brought along, and which Whimsy now perused with evident interest, was indeed arsenic, present in sufficient quantity within the deceased's stomach to indicate ingestion no later than 8 o'clock on the evening of his death. Yet there remained the peculiar absence of any vessel through which such poison might have been administered. No glass contained residue, no food bore traces, and Mr. Grayson's personal effects, when examined, contained nothing whatsoever that might have served as delivery mechanism. Whimsy walked the perimeter of the library twice, his fingers trailing across the paneling with the casual absorption of a man examining old friends rather than the scene of a capital crime, pausing occasionally to inhale deeply, as though the very air of the room might yield its secrets through olfactory inquiry alone. He paid particular attention to the fireplace, where the ashes remained undisturbed, suggesting that no document had been burned on the night in question, and to the window latches, which he confirmed were indeed fastened from the interior and showed no sign of tampering whatsoever. It was Mrs. Eleanor Craddock, summoned from her quarters and seated in the library's most uncomfortable chair, with the sort of stoic acceptance that suggested she had endured considerably worse discomforts in her lengthy career, who provided the first genuinely illuminating testimony. She had been with Mr. Grayson for 12 years, having been engaged through an agency in London that specialized in placing servants with specific requirements. A euphemism that Whimsy correctly interpreted as meaning that Grayson had required a housekeeper capable of discretion regarding his more unconventional pursuits and his visits from what Mrs. Craddock referred to, with careful primness, as certain individuals of particular scholarly interests. The deceased had maintained remarkably consistent habits, retiring to the library at 7 o'clock precisely each evening, taking with him either tea or occasionally a glass of milk, and remaining there until 10 o'clock or thereabouts, at which point he would retire upstairs to his chambers. Mrs. Craddock had noticed nothing whatsoever amiss on the evening of his death, though she did remark that Mr. Grayson had seemed distracted during dinner and had made several references to an anticipated visitor who had purportedly sent a letter that very afternoon. When pressed regarding this letter, Mrs. Craddock could only offer the information that it had been delivered by the afternoon post and that she had personally placed it upon the hall table, where Mr. Grayson had collected it before retiring to his library. Letter itself, however, had subsequently disappeared. Whether through the deliberate action of the murderer or through some other agency remained unclear. Whimsy inquired whether Mrs. Craddock had noticed anything unusual about the household in the preceding days, whether any staff members had seemed agitated, or whether Mr. Grayson had received any visitors other than his accustomed scholarly correspondence. The housekeeper's response was measured and thorough. Young Thomas Wickham had appeared more nervous than usual, though she attributed this to his mother's recent illness. Mr. Silas Kedge, the butler, had been his customary imperious self, though she had observed him in what appeared to be rather intense conversation with old Mr. Peridot the gardener on the afternoon prior to the murder. And yes, there had been a visitor on the evening in question, though the visitor had not entered the house itself but had remained on the front steps for approximately 5 minutes, in conversation with Mr. Grayson, who had answered the door personally in a manner most unusual. The visitor, according to Mrs. Craddock's description, had been a woman of perhaps 50 years, dressed in dark clothing, and possessed of what she described as an unsettling manner of gazing, as though she were observing things that others could not perceive. Whimsy's expression, upon receiving this description, underwent a subtle alteration, barely perceptible to the casual observer, yet sufficient to suggest that a piece of precisely fitting significance had just positioned itself within the increasingly complex architecture of his understanding. The interrogation of Mr. Silas Kedge, the butler, proved considerably more revealing than Whimsy's conversation with Mrs. Craddock, though perhaps not in the manner that Inspector Merriweather had anticipated. Kedge presented himself with the sort of meticulous propriety that suggested his entire existence had been conducted according to standards of deportment so rigorous that they bordered upon the pathological. His livery was immaculate, his posture architectural in its precision, and his responses to Whimsy's inquiries were delivered in tones of such calculated neutrality that one might have suspected the man of having been constructed from a superior grade of English oak, rather than mere flesh and blood. However, it was precisely this excessive perfection that caught Whimsy's attention, the sort of comportment that suggested not genuine composure, but rather a carefully maintained facade behind which considerable perturbation was being methodically suppressed. When Whimsy inquired with apparent casualness whether Mr. Kedge had been present in the house on the evening of the murder and what his duties had entailed, the butler's response was impeccably detailed. He had served dinner at 6 o'clock, had cleared the dishes at 6:30, had occupied himself with the polishing of the silver until 8 o'clock, at which point he had retired to his quarters above the kitchen, where he had remained for the remainder of the evening. A perfectly plausible account, rendered in perfectly measured tones, and yet undermined by the single inadvertent detail that Kedge had been observed in conversation with old Mr. Peridot the previous afternoon, a conversation that Mrs. Craddock had characterized as intense, and regarding which Kedge now offered no spontaneous explanation whatsoever. Whimsy pressed the matter with exquisite delicacy, suggesting that it must be fatiguing for a man of Kedge's obvious capabilities to be confined to the relatively provincial duties that Grey Lodge apparently demanded, and inquiring whether the deceased gentleman had perhaps discussed any matters of significance during their recent interactions. Kedge's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment the facade of perfection seemed to waver, revealing beneath it something considerably more complex and considerably more troubled. The butler ultimately admitted, with evident reluctance, that Mr. Grayson had made certain remarks during the preceding weeks that had suggested the master was contemplating significant changes to his household arrangements, changes that might have included the dismissal of staff members whose continued employment had become, in some manner unspecified, inconvenient. Kedge had occupied his current position for 7 years, a tenure that represented stability and security in a profession where such commodities were far from guaranteed, and the prospect of dismissal had understandably occasioned some anxiety on his part. As for his conversation with Mr. Peridot, Kedge finally acknowledged that the two men had indeed discussed certain matters of mutual concern, though the butler remained adamant that these discussions had concerned nothing more sinister than the deplorable condition of the garden paths, and Mr. Peridot's belief that the old gardener was being unjustly neglected in favor of younger staff members. The subsequent interviews with the remaining household members revealed little of immediate significance, but much of eventual importance. Young Thomas Wickham, when questioned, proved to be substantially less dim than his reputation suggested, though he possessed that particular form of youthful cunning that consisted primarily of saying as little as possible and hoping that silence might somehow constitute a form of innocence. His mother, Mrs. Sarah Wickham, was considerably more forthcoming and proved to possess that particular acuity of observation that cooks, in Whimsy's experience, invariably cultivated through years of remaining unnoticed in kitchens whilst their employers conducted their lives above stairs. She had prepared Mr. Grayson's dinner and his evening tea, both of which had been consumed in her presence with apparent relish and without any subsequent indication of distress. More importantly, she confirmed that Mr. Grayson had indeed received an unexpected visitor on the evening in question, a woman whose appearance had occasioned considerable comment among the staff precisely because female visitors were sufficiently rare at Grey Lodge to warrant notice. The woman had arrived at approximately 7 o'clock, had remained on the doorstep for what Mrs. Wickham estimated at 5 to 7 minutes, and had departed in what appeared to be some agitation, though the cook could offer no specification regarding the nature of their conversation. Mr. Grayson had then retreated to the library as was his custom, and so far as anyone had observed, had remained there until his discovery the following morning. Old Mr. Peridot, when finally summoned for questioning, presented a considerably different prospect from the servants thus far interviewed. He was, indeed, ancient, possessed of a constitution that seemed to have been constructed from some material considerably more durable than ordinary human tissue, and appeared to regard the entire investigation with the sort of philosophical indifference that comes from having witnessed considerable portions of human folly without being particularly moved by any of it. When asked regarding his conversation with Mr. Kedge, Peridot acknowledged the interaction with a brevity that suggested the matter was of minimal consequence, though he did offer one observation that seemed to strike Whimsy with notable significance. He had observed, some weeks prior, that Mr. Grayson had engaged in what appeared to be the deliberate cultivation of certain plants in the locked portion of the greenhouse, plants that Mr. Peridot identified, with a sort of specificity that came from 60 years of gardening experience, as belonging to varieties that possessed various toxic properties when ingested. When asked whether he had mentioned this observation to anyone, Peridot admitted that he had indeed brought the matter to Mr. Kedge's attention, though the butler had seemed disinclined to take particular interest in what the old gardener had characterized as the master's botanical experiments. It was at this juncture that Whimsy requested permission to examine the greenhouse, a request that Inspector Merriweather, with visible reluctance, authorized, though not without expressing considerable bewilderment regarding its relevance to the central question of how arsenic had been introduced into a locked room. The greenhouse at Grey Lodge proved to be a structure of considerable antiquity, constructed from iron and glass in that Victorian manner, which suggested its builder had possessed more enthusiasm than practical sense, regarding matters of engineering. It was divided into 3 sections, the first containing the ordinary ornamental plants that one might expect to find in the horticultural endeavors of a gentleman of leisure, the second housing what appeared to be Mr. Peridot's personal vegetable cultivation, and the third sealed behind a locked iron door for which the key was discovered, upon investigation, to be absent from the entirety of the household's collective possessions. Inspector Merriweather suggested that they might force the lock, a proposal that Whimsy rejected with such firmness that the inspector seemed momentarily taken aback, as though the suggestion had been not merely impractical, but somehow offensive to sensibilities that extended beyond the merely procedural. Instead, Whimsy examined the door with meticulous attention, requesting that old Mr. Peridot describe, in précis detail, what he had observed through the glass panes on the occasions when he had glimpsed the interior. The gardener's testimony was characteristically economical. Certain plants of a species he identified as belonging to the Aconitum family, monkshood, wolfsbane, and other varieties possessing those particular botanical properties that made them considerably more famous in medieval poisoning literature than in legitimate horticultural practice. Additionally, there had been what appeared to be various apparatus for the distillation and concentration of plant extracts, equipment that suggested Mr. Grayson's scholarly interests had extended into territories that conventional academia would have regarded with considerable suspicion. It was Whimsy's observation, delivered with apparent irrelevance whilst examining the exterior door frame, that the lock appeared to have been installed, comparatively recently, within the past 18 months, according to his estimation, and that the key had likely been deliberately removed from circulation rather than mislaid through ordinary negligence. This suggestion occasioned a marked reaction from Inspector Merriweather, whose expression underwent that particular transformation that occurs when a police officer suddenly grasps that a piece of evidence he has been regarding as incidental might in fact constitute something considerably more significant. The inspector immediately dispatched Constable Davies to interview the local locksmith, a task that occupied the young constable for the better part of 3 hours, and which ultimately produced the information that Mr. Grayson had indeed commissioned the installation of the lock in question some 17 months prior, and had subsequently purchased a replacement lock of identical specification, the key to which had been entrusted to no member of the household staff. The original key Rima, ined in Mr. Grayson's possession at the time of his death, or rather, it had remained with him until some point subsequent to his demise, at which juncture it had mysteriously vanished, a disappearance that suggested either that the murderer possessed knowledge of the greenhouse cultivation, or that the matter of the locked room was considerably more theatrical in its construction than straightforward investigation had thus far suggested. Whimsy returned to the library at this juncture and requested permission to conduct a thorough examination of Mr. Grayson's personal correspondence, a request that Inspector Merriweather granted with the proviso that a constable remain present throughout the proceedings to ensure that nothing of evidential significance might be disturbed or removed. The correspondence proved to be extensive, encompassing hundreds of letters spanning a period of approximately 15 years, and covering topics that ranged from the obscure to the actively esoteric. However, it was a small bundle of letters, bound together with a faded ribbon and concealed within a hollowed volume of medieval Latin poetry, that proved to be of particular relevance. These letters were written in an elegant feminine hand and were signed only with the initial C, though the content made abundantly clear that C represented someone possessed of considerably more than passing familiarity with Mr. Grayson's person and pursuits. The letters spanned a period of approximately 5 years and detailed, in increasingly urgent tones, a relationship that had apparently commenced in scholarly collaboration and had evolved into something considerably more complicated and considerably more emotionally turbulent. The most recent letter, dated merely 3 weeks prior to the murder, contained language that suggested considerable agitation on the part of the correspondent, references to betrayal and unspeakable perfidy, and a concluding sentence that read, with ominous clarity, "I shall not permit you to destroy what we have built together, nor shall I allow you to consign me to obscurity whilst you pursue your new pretensions." We must speak of this matter urgently, and the consequences, should you refuse, shall be upon your own head." Inspector Merryweather's enthusiasm regarding this discovery was palpable and immediate, and he launched into a lengthy exposition regarding the probability that C represented a woman of romantic inclination who had taken exception to what appeared to be Mr. Grayson's intention to terminate their association. The obvious suspect, in the inspector's estimation, was Miss Constance Grayson, the deceased's sister, who had recently returned to England from Florence and who had, somewhat inconveniently for the purposes of the investigation, taken rooms at the local inn in the village. A telegram had been dispatched requesting her attendance at Grey Lodge for purposes of formal interrogation. However, Whimsy regarded this conclusion with evident skepticism, suggesting that the matter was considerably more complex than simple romantic revenge, and that the initials C might with equal validity reference any number of individuals whose connection to Mr. Grayson remained as yet unknown. He requested permission to conduct interviews with both Mr. Edmund Grayson, the disinherited nephew, and with certain individuals in the village who might possess knowledge of Mr. Grayson's more unconventional academic associations. Inspector Merryweather, whose patience was being tested by Whimsy's apparent reluctance to embrace the obvious solution, nevertheless acquiesced to these requests, though he made clear his conviction that the matter would ultimately prove to be far more straightforward than the detective from London appeared inclined to believe. Mr. Edmund Grayson presented himself at Grey Lodge the following morning with an air of barely suppressed resentment and the sort of sartorial negligence that suggested a man whose financial circumstances had recently undergone significant alteration in an unfavorable direction. He was, by his own accounting, 31 years of age, though he possessed that particular appearance of accelerated dissolution that comes from combining moderate dissipation with considerable financial anxiety over an extended period of years. The cottage in which he resided, situated as it was adjacent to the churchyard, apparently served as both his domicile and his place of business, the latter consisting of what appeared to be a rather desultory practice in the composition of occasional verse and the furnishing of literary criticism to provincial periodicals, occupations that seemed unlikely to have generated any substantial income, even in the most propitious of circumstances. Whimsy's interview with the nephew took place in the library, conducted with a courtesy that seemed to amuse Edmund considerably more than it reassured him, and it became rapidly apparent that the young man harbored no particularly elaborate illusions regarding the reason for his uncle's recent alteration of his will. The original bequest of £3,000 had been withdrawn upon Mr. Grayson's discovery that Edmund had incurred considerable gambling debts in London, and had apparently attempted, some months prior, to gain access to advance portions of his anticipated inheritance through the mediumship of various disreputable moneylenders and equally disreputable legal representatives. Edmund's account of his movements on the evening of the murder was straightforward and corroborated by the landlady of the small public house located some 2 streets distant from his cottage. He had consumed his evening meal at approximately 6 o'clock, had subsequently repaired to the public house, where he had remained until nearly midnight, engaging in what appeared to be the fairly comprehensive consumption of bitter beer and the mechanical playing of darts with 2 other gentlemen whose permanent residence at the establishment suggested they possessed few superior alternatives for the occupation of their time. The landlady had seen him depart at approximately 11:45, and he had presumably retired to his cottage, where he had remained until the following morning. Inspector Merryweather had already verified these facts through direct interview with the landlady herself, a woman of approximately 60 years whose powers of observation seemed to have been considerably sharpened by 4 decades of observing the social degradations that occur when alcohol is combined with limited intelligence and even more limited prospects. However, it was Whimsy's observation, delivered almost parenthetically, whilst examining the bookshelf that lined the library wall, that Edmund appeared to possess considerably more familiarity with the contents of his uncle's collection than one might have anticipated in a young man who had apparently manifested little scholarly interest in his previous interactions with the deceased. When questioned regarding this apparent contradiction, Edmund admitted with evident reluctance that he had actually visited Grey Lodge on several occasions during the preceding year, ostensibly to discuss financial matters with his uncle, but in reality to conduct what he characterized as preliminary investigations into the nature of his anticipated inheritance. These preliminary investigations, Edmund further clarified when pressed, had involved a certain amount of furtive examination of the contents of his uncle's library, and, on at least one occasion, an ate. MPT, to gain access to the locked greenhouse through the simple expedient of climbing through an adjacent window, an attempt that had failed owing to his uncle's unfortunate appearance at precisely the moment when Edmund had succeeded in forcing the window open. This admission occasioned considerable interest from Inspector Merriweather, who seemed to regard it as evidence of criminal inclination, if not actual homicidal intent. However, Whimsy's response to this revelation was to inquire, with apparent irrelevance, whether Edmund possessed any knowledge regarding the precise nature of the plants that his uncle had been cultivating in the locked section of the greenhouse, and whether he had ever observed his uncle preparing any particular decoctions or extracts from those plants. Edmund's response was negative, though he admitted that he had observed various apparatus within the greenhouse that suggested his uncle had been engaged in some form of chemical experimentation. More significantly, when Whimsy inquired whether Edmund had ever encountered any female visitors to Grey Lodge during his various clandestine inspections of the premises, the young man's expression underwent a marked alteration, a flushing of the face, combined with a sudden intensification of attention that suggested the question had struck some particularly sensitive nerve. After a moment's hesitation, Edmund admitted that he had indeed observed a woman visiting Grey Lodge on several occasions during the preceding months. A woman of perhaps 50 years of age, whose appearance had seemed notably unusual, and whose demeanor had suggested considerable agitation during her interactions with Mr. Grayson. He had not observed this woman closely on any occasion, having been preoccupied with his own purposes during his visits, but he had formed the impression that his uncle's interactions with this particular visitor had been characterized by a tension and an intimacy that suggested a relationship considerably more profound than mere scholarly collaboration. When asked whether he possessed any information regarding the woman's identity, Edmund could offer nothing more substantive than the observation that she had arrived on at least 2 occasions in a carriage bearing no visible insignia or identifying marks, a detail that suggested either considerable discretion on the woman's part or a deliberate intention to obscure her social connections and probable residence. It was at this juncture that Whimsy requested permission to conduct certain inquiries in the village itself, suggesting that the mystery woman's identity might be established through consultation with the local tradespeople and other individuals whose observations might have captured details that had escaped the attention of those resident within Grey Lodge itself. Inspector Merriweather, recognizing that his own resources had been somewhat exhausted by conventional investigative methods, consented to this proposal with a grace that suggested increasing respect for Whimsy's methodologies, even if those methodologies remained as yet incomprehensible in their ultimate objective. The village of Ashford in the Mist, upon closer examination than Whimsy's initial traverse had permitted, revealed itself to be considerably less quaint and considerably more complex in its social stratification than the casual observer might have anticipated. The High Street, such as it was, contained the usual assemblage of provincial establishments, a general merchant of indifferent competence, a post office presided over by a woman of approximately 70 whose powers of observation seemed to have been developed to a degree that bordered upon the supernatural, a chemist whose shop window displayed an array of patent medicines and tonics of dubious therapeutic value, and various other commercial enterprises that together suggested a community of perhaps 800 souls whose primary occupations consisted of agriculture, light manufacturing, and the provision of services to those of more substantial means who maintained country residences in the surrounding district. It was in the chemist's shop that Whimsy's inquiries began, prompted by the observation that certain substances required for the cultivation and concentration of plant extracts would inevitably necessitate purchase from a local source, and that such purchases would almost certainly have been noted and remembered by a person engaged in the dispensing of pharmaceutical materials. The proprietor, a Mr. Herbert Ashton of approximately 55 years, proved to possess that particular combination of professional discretion and genuine curiosity that marks the accomplished pharmacist, and he admitted, with some evident reluctance, that Mr. Grayson had indeed made various purchases over the preceding 2 years that had suggested botanical rather than medical interests. These purchases had included apparatus for distillation, various chemical reagents, and, most significantly, several quantities of materials that Mr. Ashton identified as being consistent with the preparation of plant-derived alkaloids. However, Mr. Ashton's recollection underwent a marked alteration when Whimsy inquired whether Mr. Grayson had made these purchases personally, or whether he had perhaps engaged an intermediary to conduct certain transactions on his behalf. After a moment's evident internal struggle, Mr. Ashton acknowledged that he had indeed received several visits from a woman who had presented herself as acting on behalf of a gentleman engaged in scholarly research, and who had made various purchases utilizing currency that had been provided by her employer. This W. Oman had visited on perhaps 4 or 5 occasions over the preceding 18 months, and her most recent visit had occurred some 10 days prior to Mr. Grayson's death. When pressed regarding the woman's identity and description, Mr. Ashton proved disappointingly vague, offering only the observation that she had been a woman of perhaps 50 years, of somewhat austere appearance, and possessed of an accent that suggested either Scottish or Northern English origins, though he could not specify with certainty which of these origins was the more probable. More significantly, on at least one occasion, another woman had accompanied her, a younger woman of perhaps 30 years whose appearance had been remarkable primarily for its ordinariness and whose demeanor had suggested considerable deference to her older companion. This revelation occasioned a marked intensification of Whimsy's interest, and he requested that Mr. Ashton describe, with as much precision as memory permitted, the nature of the conversations that had occurred during these transactions. The chemist recalled that the older woman had been notably specific regarding the quantities and specifications of the materials she required, suggesting considerable familiarity with their properties and applications, and that she had made several remarks that suggested knowledge of classical texts pertaining to the preparation of poisonous substances. Most significantly, during what appeared to be her final visit, the woman had inquired regarding the preparation of arsenic solutions and their properties when introduced into food or drink, questions that had struck Mr. Ashton as sufficiently unusual that he had formed the intention to report the matter to the local police. However, his intention had not been acted upon prior to the discovery of Mr. Grayson's death, and he now seemed inclined to regard his failure to act with considerable self-recrimination. The postmistress, when subsequently interviewed regarding the receipt and dispatch of correspondence, proved considerably more forthcoming in her information, though her discretion had apparently been overcome by a combination of professional pride in her observational acuity and a certain satisfaction in possessing information that appeared to be of genuine investigative significance. She confirmed that Mr. Grayson had received numerous letters bearing Scottish postmarks, particularly from addresses in Edinburgh, and that the handwriting on at least several of these missives appeared to be that of a woman. Additionally, she had observed that certain letters had been dispatched from Greylodge bearing the same Scottish postmarks, a circumstance that suggested correspondence of a nature sufficiently significant that Mr. Grayson had maintained regular written communication with Scottish recipients. Most remarkably, she had also processed at least 3 letters that bore the postmark of Florence, Italy, and which she believed to have been addressed to or dispatched from Miss Constance Grayson, though her certainty regarding this matter was somewhat qualified by the fact that she had not been authorized to examine the contents of such correspondence. When Whimsy inquired whether the postmistress possessed any recollection regarding a woman of perhaps 50 years who had conducted herself with unusual authority and who had occasionally collected mail addressed to false names or to general delivery, the postmistress's face underwent a remarkable transformation, her expression shifting from professional neutrality to something approximating genuine consternation. She admitted, with considerable apparent distress, that she had indeed become aware of a pattern of mail collection that had suggested either identity deception or the conduct of private matters under assumed designations, though she had assumed these matters to be of a sufficiently innocent character as to warrant no particular intervention on her part. The woman in question had occasionally presented herself to collect mail addressed to Miss C. Hargreaves, a name that had proven, upon subsequent investigation by Whimsy, to correspond to no individual of record in the village or its immediate vicinity. The arrival of Miss Constance Grayson at Grey Lodge on the afternoon of Whimsy's village investigations occasioned a certain degree of dramatic tension that seemed to have been considerably amplified by the accumulation of evidence suggesting her possible involvement in her brother's demise. She presented herself in the drawing-room with a bearing that suggested considerable familiarity with situations of social discomfort, and her initial remarks regarding the circumstances of her brother's death were delivered in tones of measured grief that seemed to contain, beneath their surface of conventional mourning, undertones of something considerably more complex and considerably more troubling. She was, upon examination, precisely the age and appearance that Edmund had described, approximately 49 years of age, possessed of features that might have been handsome in their youth but which had been rendered austere by the passage of time, and apparently by the habitual exercise of considerable emotional restraint. Her clothing suggested both substantial means and a deliberate rejection of contemporary fashion, in favor of styles that had achieved their apotheosis some 15 or 20 years prior. And her accent, though refined, contained traces of Scottish influence that suggested either an extended period of residence north of the border or origins in regions sufficiently proximate to Scotland as to have influenced her speech patterns. Inspector Merryweather's interrogation of Miss Constance was characterized by a directness that seemed to border upon the accusatory, and he made abundantly clear his belief that she represented the primary suspect in her brother's murder, motivated by a combination of romantic betrayal, which the letters signed C seemed to suggest, and financial considerations regarding the disposition of the estate. Miss Constance's response to these accusations was remarkable, primarily for its apparent indifference to the inspector's accusations and for the forthright acknowledgement that she had indeed been the author of the letters in question, correspondence that had documented not a romantic entanglement, but rather a professional and intellectual partnership that had extended over a period of approximately 15 years. She and her brother, she explained with evident reluctance, had engaged together in research pertaining to the historical practices of what she characterized as folk medicine and its evolution into the modern therapeutic sciences, research that had necessitated the study of certain substances and methodologies that conventional academic institutions had regarded with considerable disfavor. The letters that had been discovered represented correspondence in which she had protested her brother's apparent intention to terminate their collaborative work and to abandon the research in favor of what she described as respectability and the mundane concerns of society. However, she emphasized, her protests had been intellectual rather than romantic in their nature, and while she had indeed harbored considerable disappointment regarding her brother's apparent defection from their shared work, she had certainly harbored no murderous intentions toward him. When pressed regarding her presence in the village on the evening of the murder, Miss Constance acknowledged that she had indeed arrived the previous day and had visited Grey Lodge on the evening in question, arriving at approximately 7 o'clock and remaining for approximately 5 to 7 minutes in conversation with her brother upon the front steps. The purpose of this visit, according to Miss Constance's account, had been to make a final attempt to persuade her brother to reconsider his decision to abandon their research and to introduce her to a potential colleague who she believed might prove sympathetic to their work and who possessed resources sufficient to fund continued investigations. However, her brother had been adamant in his refusal, stating that he had come to regard their research as fundamentally misconceived and that he intended to dissociate himself from it entirely and to destroy all records and materials pertaining to their collaborative work. This revelation occasioned considerable agitation on Miss Constance's part, though she insisted that her agitation had been intellectual in its origins rather than murderous in its implications. She had returned to her rooms at the local inn and had subsequently retired for the evening, where she had remained until the following morning, when she had learned of her brother's death through the mediumship of local gossip and the subsequent arrival of official notification. Her account was delivered with such precision and such apparent honesty that even Inspector Merriweather seemed inclined to regard it with a degree of credence, though he remained unconvinced that Miss Constance's involvement in the matter had been entirely passive or uninvolved. Whimsy, however, regarded Miss Constance with an expression of considerable interest, and he posed to her a question of such apparent irrelevance that both the inspector and Miss Constance herself seemed momentarily confused regarding its significance. He inquired whether her brother had ever mentioned to her the cultivation of certain plants in the locked greenhouse, and whether she possessed any knowledge regarding the purposes to which such plants were intended to be put. Miss Constance's response was notable primarily for its hesitation and for the evident internal struggle that seemed to accompany her formulation of a reply. She ultimately admitted that she was indeed aware of her brother's botanical cultivation, and that she had in fact advised him regarding certain methodologies pertaining to the concentration of plant alkaloids that might prove medically useful if properly isolated and properly administered. However, she insisted that this advice had been rendered in the context of legitimate medical research, and with no intention whatsoever that the materials in question should be employed for any murderous purpose. It was at this juncture that Whimsy requested permission from Inspector Merriweather to conduct a private conversation with Miss Constance, a request that the inspector granted with evident reluctance, and only after making abundantly clear his conviction that any such private interview should not be permitted to constitute an impediment to her potential arrest should sufficient evidence materialize to warrant such action. The conversation between Whimsy and Miss Constance, conducted in the library with the door firmly closed, proved to be of sufficient duration that Inspector Merriweather began to manifest observable signs of agitation, pacing the corridor outside with the sort of rhythmic precision that suggested considerable internal perturbation regarding the propriety of permitting such an interview to continue unobserved and unrecorded. When Whimsy emerged from the library some 40 minutes subsequent to his private conversation with Miss Constance, his demeanor suggested that he had arrived at conclusions of considerable significance, though he remained characteristically disinclined to articulate those conclusions with any degree of clarity or immediacy. Inspector Merriweather's inquiries regarding the nature and substance of his discussion with the deceased sister were met with polite evasions and observations of such apparent irrelevance that the inspector seemed to regard them as constituting a deliberate impediment to the progress of the investigation rather than any genuine attempt at communication. Instead, Whimsy requested that Inspector Merriweather arrange for a reconstruction of the events of the evening preceding Mr. Grayson's death, suggesting that certain details of the established timeline might benefit from practical verification rather than mere intellectual analysis. This proposal occasioned considerable bewilderment on the part of the inspector, who seemed inclined to regard the entire matter as fundamentally resolved and requiring only the formality of arrest and prosecution to achieve its conclusion. However, Inspector Merriweather's authority over the investigation seemed to rest upon sufficiently firm ground that Whimsy's suggestions, however unconventional, were not to be in tier. Illy dismissed, and he accordingly consented to the reconstruction, though not without expressing his considerable skepticism regarding the probability that such a theatrical exercise would produce any evidence of genuine investigative significance. The reconstruction was scheduled for the following evening, at the precise hour at which Mr. Grayson had retired to the library on the night of his death, 7 o'clock precisely, as had been his invariable custom, according to the testimony of the household staff. The participants in this theatrical exercise included Inspector Merriweather and Constable Davies, representing the official investigative apparatus, Miss Constance Grayson, who had consented to participate in the reenactment of her visit to Grey Lodge on the evening of the murder, and the various members of the household staff, each of whom was positioned at their customary locations during the evening hours. Additionally, and with evident reluctance on the part of Inspector Merriweather, Whimsy had requested the presence of Mr. Silas Kedge, the butler, in his ordinary capacity as servant, rather than in any interrogative or investigative capacity. The reconstitution of events proceeded with methodical precision. Miss Constance arrived at the appointed hour, was admitted to the front steps by Mr. Grayson, and the two engaged in conversation of approximately the duration that had been previously established. The household staff occupied themselves with their customary evening duties, the cook preparing the evening meal, the housemaid tidying the drawing room, and the butler attending to such miscellaneous tasks as the evening hours ordinarily demanded. At 7:30 precisely, Miss Constance departed, Mr. Grayson retreated to the library, and the household settled into its accustomed evening routines. It was at this juncture that Whimsy requested that Mr. Grayson's customary tea service be prepared according to precisely the same specifications that Mrs. Sarah Wickham ordinarily employed, and that it be delivered to the library at the precise hour at which it had been delivered on the evening of the murder. Mrs. Wickham protested that she possessed no recollection of the precise time at which the tea service had been delivered, though she insisted that it had followed her usual custom, which involved the preparation of tea at approximately 8 o'clock and its delivery to the library at approximately 8:15. The reconstitution proceeded according to this schedule, and Mrs. Wickham delivered the tea service to the library door, where it was received by Mr. Grayson with apparent satisfaction. However, it was at this moment that Whimsy introduced what appeared to be a deliberate alteration to the established procedures. He requested that the drawing-room clock, which had been observed to be running approximately 5 minutes fast, be examined by Constable Davies to confirm the precise time according to that instrument's indication. This examination revealed a discrepancy between the drawing-room clock and the library clock that amounted to approximately 25 minutes. A circumstance that seemed to occasion profound consternation on the part of Inspector Merriweather, who suddenly perceived the potential significance of temporal discrepancies that had previously seemed to him to be matters of mere domestic negligence rather than investigative consequence. Whimsy then suggested that the reconstruction proceed as though the evening were progressing according to its normal course, and that all participants should occupy themselves with their customary activities as though no investigation were in progress and no murder had been committed. The household settled into an approximation of normalcy, though the artificial nature of the proceedings rendered such normalcy considerably more theatrical than genuine. At approximately 9:30, Whimsy requested that Constable Davies proceed to the library to verify the condition of Mr. Grayson, a task that the constable undertook with obvious trepidation, apparently expecting to discover the body of the simulated victim in some state of advanced decomposition. However, Mr. Grayson was observed to be alive, sitting in his customary armchair and apparently engaged in the perusal of a scholarly manuscript. At this juncture, Whimsy requested that everyone vacate the library with the exception of Mr. Silas Kedge, and he instructed the butler to proceed with whatever tasks the butler ordinarily undertook during the evening hours, including any that might necessitate proximity to or entrance into the library itself. Kedge's response was to profess ignorance regarding any customary evening tasks that would necessarily require library access, though his demeanor suggested considerable internal perturbation at being singled out for such particular attention. It was at this precise moment that Whimsy delivered an observation that seemed to crystallize the entire investigation into sudden and terrible clarity, though the observation itself appeared initially to possess no particular relevance to the matter at hand. He remarked, with the sort of casual indifference that characterized his most significant deductions, that the clock upon the library mantelpiece had been running slow not through mechanical malfunction, but through deliberate manipulation, and that this manipulation had been accomplished through a methodology so elementary that it had escaped notice precisely because of its very simplicity. The pendulum, he explained, had been set slightly out of true through the expedient of placing a small object, a coin perhaps or a piece of lead, behind suspension mechanism, a circumstance that would have retarded the clock's progression without producing any obvious evidence of tampering to the casual observer. More significantly, he suggested that such manipulation would have been most readily accomplished by someone possessed of intimate familiarity with the mechanism and with access to the clock during a period when its observation by other household members was unlikely. Inspector Merriweather, upon comprehending the implications of this observation, seemed to undergo a sudden and dramatic alteration in his investigative assumptions, his gaze shifting from Miss Constance Grayson to Mr. Silas Kedge with an intensity that suggested the reorganization of his entire understanding of the crime. Whimsy proceeded to articulate, with meticulous precision and without deviation from strict logical sequence, the mechanism by which the murder had been accomplished. The poisoning, he explained, had not occurred during the evening hours as the established timeline had suggested, but rather during the afternoon of the day preceding the discovery of the body. Mr. Grayson had consumed his afternoon tea, which had been served to him by Mr. Kedge at approximately 4 o'clock, and this tea had been poisoned through the introduction of a carefully prepared extract derived from the monkshood and other toxic plants that had been cultivated in the greenhouse. However, the arsenic that had been detected in Mr. Grayson's stomach during the post-mortem examination had been introduced subsequent to death, a detail that suggested not a poisoning, but a theatrical staging designed to obscure the true mechanism of the murder and to introduce deliberate temporal confusion into the investigation. The clock had been retarded to suggest that Mr. Grayson had remained alive until a considerably later hour than had in fact been the case, and the locked room had been rendered immaterial through the simple expedient of Mr. Kedge's possession of a key that had been manufactured, without the knowledge of Mr. Grayson or any other member of the household. This key had been obtained through the locksmith who had originally installed the lock, an individual to whom Mr. Kedge had presented himself with a carefully fabricated story regarding his supposed role as Mr. Grayson's business representative. The motive, Whimsy continued, became apparent upon examination of Mr. Grayson's correspondence and his recent alterations to his will. Mr. Grayson had discovered that Mr. Kedge, over a period of several years, had been systematically abstracting small quantities of money from the household accounts, a theft that had been concealed through the meticulous falsification of records and through the butler's comprehensive knowledge of Mr. Grayson's habitual inattention to domestic financial matters. However, Mr. Grayson had recently engaged a professional accountant to conduct a thorough examination of the household finances, and this accountant had uncovered evidence of systematic embezzlement that amounted to a considerable sum. Mr. Grayson had confronted Mr. Kedge regarding this matter some 2 weeks prior to the murder, and had informed the butler that he intended to prosecute the matter to the full extent of the law. Moreover, Mr. Grayson had expressed his intention to provide testimony that would result not merely in criminal proceedings, but in the effective destruction of Mr. Kedge's professional reputation, rendering him unemployable in any respectable household for the remainder of his life. This threat had provided Mr. Kedge with motivation sufficiently compelling to justify the commission of murder, and his knowledge of Mr. Grayson's scholarly interests had provided him with both the means and the opportunity to accomplish the crime in a manner that seemed to suggest either suicide or accidental poisoning rather than homicide. The involvement of Miss Constance Grayson in the matter had been peripheral rather than central, though her presence in the village and her visit to Grey Lodge on the evening of the murder had provided Mr. Kedge with a convenient opportunity to introduce additional temporal confusion into the investigation. He had deliberately ensured that Miss Constance's visit would be observed by household staff, and he had calculated that the obvious suspicion regarding her involvement would occupy the attention of the investigating authorities whilst he conducted himself with the sort of meticulous propriety and apparent cooperation that characterized his entire demeanor throughout the investigation. The secondary poisoning through arsenic had been introduced post-mortem through the expedient of Mr. Kedge's access to the locked library during the hours immediately following Mr. Grayson's death, when the household was in chaos and when the movement of staff members was characteristically disorganized. This additional poisoning had served no purpose other than to introduce superficial complexity into the matter and to suggest that the crime had been accomplished through some elaborate mechanism rather than through the simple administration of a toxic substance during the afternoon hours when Mr. Grayson's death would have passed without observation or remark. As Whimsy articulated these conclusions, Mr. Silas Kedge's demeanor underwent a dramatic and irreversible alteration. The carefully maintained facade of professional composure seemed to disintegrate with visible rapidity, and the butler's features underwent a transformation that suggested the sudden liberation of emotions that had been suppressed and constrained through years of habitual self-control. He did not immediately confess to the crime, nor did he offer any elaborate justification for his actions, but he also did not offer any coherent denial of Whimsy's accusations. Instead, he seemed to collapse into himself, his posture deteriorating from architectural precision into something approximating physical dissolution, and when Inspector Merriweather advanced with the intention of placing him under formal arrest, Mr. Kedge offered no resistance whatsoever, submitting to the procedure with the passivity of a man who had already acknowledged, if only to himself, the inevitability of his apprehension and the justness of his impending condemnation. The confession, when it came, was rendered in a voice so diminished and so devoid of inflection that it seemed to emanate from some entity considerably less substantial than the man who had presented himself to the world as Mr. Silas Kedge for the preceding 7 years. He admitted, with a precision that suggested either long rehearsal or a mind of considerable clarity, despite its current emotional devastation, to the systematic embezzlement that had occupied the better portion of his tenure at Grey Lodge, characterizing his theft as recompense for years of service rendered to individuals of inconsiderable gratitude and considerable meanness of spirit. However, he insisted, with a vehemence that seemed to constitute the final assertion of his damaged pride, that he had not contemplated murder until the moment when Mr. Grayson had informed him of his intention to prosecute the matter and to destroy his reputation entirely. The prospect of imprisonment had seemed to Kedge less terrible than the prospect of becoming an object of contempt and ridicule throughout the professional world to which he belonged, and he had therefore conceived the notion that Mr. Grayson's death, properly arranged and adequately disguised, might serve his purposes more effectively than flight or attempted restitution. He had observed, through his years of service, that Mr. Grayson possessed considerable fascination with the properties of various toxic substances, and he had accordingly studied his master's research with sufficient attention to comprehend the methodologies by which such substances might be extracted and administered. The afternoon tea service had provided the opportunity, and the subsequent introduction of arsenic had been accomplished during the hours of confusion immediately following the discovery of the body, when his access to the locked library had been neither questioned nor observed. The matter of the locked room and the retarded clock had been, Kedge acknowledged, deliberate complications introduced with the intention of rendering the crime more mysterious and more difficult to resolve, complications that he had calculated would occupy the investigating authorities for a period sufficiently extended to permit him to arrange his affairs and either attempt flight or simply resign himself to eventual apprehension. He had anticipated, with a degree of accuracy that seemed almost prophetic in its precision, that the obvious suspicion would fall upon either Miss Constance Grayson or upon Mr. Edmund Grayson, and he had carefully arranged his own comportment to suggest cooperation rather than guilt. The involvement of the younger woman who had accompanied Miss Constance on certain of her visits to the chemist had been, Kedge insisted, entirely fortuitous, and he had observed this arrangement with mild surprise rather than with any intention of incorporating her into his elaborate fictional narrative regarding the crime. Inspector Merriweather received this confession with the satisfaction of a man whose intellectual powers had been vindicated and whose professional competence had been affirmed through the hours. Tea and admission of guilt from a perpetrator of considerable cunning and considerable premeditation. Constable Davies, meanwhile, seemed to regard the entire affair as constituting a degree of excitement considerably in excess of anything that his provincial posting ordinarily provided, and he appeared eager to disseminate the details of the case throughout the village with whatever expedients might be permitted by his official duties. Whimsy's response to Mr. Kedge's confession was characteristically oblique and characteristically infused with a quality of profound melancholy that seemed to suggest that his satisfaction in the resolution of the case was tempered by considerable distaste for the human factors that had necessitated such resolution. He suggested, with a gentleness that seemed incongruous with his customary manner, that Mr. Kedge had probably been a competent and conscientious servant in his earlier years, and that the trajectory toward crime that had characterized his more recent history probably represented not an aberration of character, but rather a gradual erosion of moral sensibility occasioned by years of service to individuals who had consistently undervalued and underappreciated his labor. The embezzlement, Whimsy suggested, had perhaps commenced as a form of unconscious protest against this undervaluation, and the murder had followed as the inevitable conclusion of a process that had begun not with criminal intent, but with the simple conviction that the world had treated him unjustly, and that he was therefore entitled to compensation for his suffering. This observation occasioned no particular reaction from Mr. Kedge, who seemed to have passed beyond the capacity for emotional response or philosophical contemplation, and who submitted to his formal arrest with the passivity of a man whose capacity for resistance had been entirely exhausted. The resolution of the matter occasioned considerable professional gratification for Inspector Merriweather, who seemed disposed to regard the case as constituting a triumph of conventional investigative methodology, rather than acknowledging the degree to which Whimsy's unconventional observations and theatrical reconstructions had been essential to the identification of the guilty party. Canon Fotheringham Thomas, meanwhile, seemed principally preoccupied with the ecclesiastical implications of the crime, and with his own role in having summoned Whimsy to the village, a role that he appeared to regard as constituting either a triumph of clerical discernment or a profound indictment of his own judgment, depending upon his mood at any given moment. Miss Constance Grayson, upon learning of Mr. Kedge's culpability and her own exoneration, seemed to undergo a process of emotional recalibration that suggested she had been experiencing considerable internal anxiety regarding the possibility of her own involvement being discovered and misinterpreted. She departed Grey Lodge within the week, returning to her residence in Edinburgh, where she apparently continued her scholarly research into the historical properties of various botanical substances, research that seemed to have acquired considerably greater legitimacy in the academic world following the publicity attendant upon her brother's murder. Whimsy departed the village on the morning following Mr. Kedge's formal confession, his Daimler conveying him back toward London through the persistent mist that seemed to have acquired, in the aftermath of the investigation, a quality of melancholy rather than Gothic menace. When Inspector Merriweather thanked him for his intervention and expressed gratitude for his assistance in resolving a case that had seemed initially impenetrable, Whimsy responded with a characteristic observation rega. Reading the nature of locked rooms and the manner in which they invariably yielded to solution, once one recognized that the lock itself was often the least significant barrier to understanding. As he settled into his motor car, Whimsy remarked to Bunter, with the sort of philosophical resignation that seemed to characterize his demeanor in the aftermath of particularly unsettling investigations, that the most troubling aspect of the entire matter had been the recognition that Mr. Kedge had probably been right in his assessment that the world had treated him unjustly, and that this recognition provided no consolation whatsoever to either the dead or the condemned.